Alright, in this Unity tutorial, I show you how to jump and also do basic movement. Also, this tutorial will be for Unity 2D. The source code will be available in the description, and without further ado, let's get right into it. All I have in my project currently is a player, a camera, and some assets. And really our first question is, how do we make our player jump? Well, we're going to need gravity, so let's look at our game object and let's add a rigid body 2D. I'm going to set the gravity to 2, and I'm also going to freeze rotation on the z-axis. We also need our player to be able to touch the ground, so I'm going to add a box collider 2D next. Then I'm just going to edit the collider to where it fits my character. Then we're going to need to make a script. I'm just going to call mine player. And going inside the script, we're going to need to create 4 fields. Our first one will just be a reference to our rigid body. Then I'm going to create a float for movement in the X direction, because we're going to move left and right. A vector 2 for movement. And also a float for the move speed. Then in the start function, I'll go ahead and get that rigid body component. And in the update function, we're going to set move X to be input to get access for a horizontal. Then in fixed update, which is what you can do for physics, we're going to set movement to just be a new vector 2 based on our move speed and keeping the velocity for the Y the same. And finally, we will affect the rigid body's velocity based on our movement. Then going back to the editor, let's drag the player script onto our player game object. As you can see, it's on the player now. Then, since we have gravity, we need a ground for our player to stand on. So I'm just going to create an empty game object here. I'm going to call it ground. Go ahead and add a sprite so you can see it. Change the scale, move it around a bit, change the color. I'm also going to add a box collider 2D to it. I'll change the order and layer to -1 so that the platform appears behind the player. Then let's just test it out. Alright, we can move left and right. Very nice. But how do we add jumping? Well, whoops. Let's add that in next. So let's go back to our player script. I'm going to remove those 2 imports at the top here. And I'm going to create a few variables. First, a float. Public float for the jump force, a layer mask which represents anything in our world that we consider to be the ground, call it ground layer. Then we also need a box collider 2D that will help us detect when we touch the ground. And also we need a bool to represent whether or not we are currently on the ground. In our start function, we're going to set onGround to true so that no matter what, when we start, we'll be able to jump at least once. Then in our update function, we want to say, if the player presses space, so input.getKeyCode down space, and we're currently on the ground, then we'll do the following. We will apply the jump force to our rigid body's velocity, and then we'll say, all right, we are no longer on the ground, so we're going to make that bool false. So the question then is, how do we detect when we're on the ground? Well, we can do that with the onTrigger enter2D method like so. And all we'll do here is check to see if what we collided with is on the ground layer. And if it is, then we will simply set onGround to true, which will allow us to jump again. Okay, with that, let's go back into our editor. Now we're going to create the ground layer. We can do that by selecting a game object, going up to layer here, clicking add layer. I'm just going to go to layer 3 and write ground. Now you can select ground as the layer for your game object. So we'll go ahead and do that for our ground object. Then on our player script, I'm going to set the ground layer to ground. Also, we need to create a ground collider for our player, so I'm going to create a child object and call it ground check. Add a box collider 2D component to it, and then I'm just going to set the collider to be slightly beneath his feet, the reason being so that he can jump a little early. I'm also going to enable isTrigger to be true, which is important. Then finally, on our player object, we want to set our ground collider to be ground check. After that, I'm going to go ahead and add some extra platforms here, just so that we can test our jumping. Alright, now let's test it out. Okay, awesome. Looks like we can jump quite nicely. Be sure to keep in mind, if you want to change your jump still, you can always just change the gravity scale or the jump force. So I went ahead and added some animation and just some extra platforms. This is just an example to show you that if you wanted to, you could definitely take this script and start making a platforming game out of it, or really anything. So yeah, if you need any help or have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. And if this was useful, like, subscribe. Other than that, have a great day. Peace.